Three countries walked away from West Africa's main regional bloc. Together, they represent approximately 76 million people and over 1 million square kilometers of land. Their exit wasn't just a political split. It could reshape how the region trades, defends itself, and speaks with one voice. Welcome to the Africa Briefing Room, where Africa's headlines meet hard analysis. Today, we're unpacking why ECOWAS was created, what it promised, and why it's now facing its deepest fracture in decades. The setup. January 2024. The air in West Africa crackled with rupture. Three nations, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, pushed back their chairs and walked away from the table. In a single move, they abandoned an institution nearly 50 years in the making, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. Their statement was scathing. They accused the bloc of betraying its Pan-African ideals, bowing to foreign influence, and punishing their people with what they called inhumane sanctions. This was no diplomatic performance. These Sahel nations had endured years of closed borders, embargoes, and political isolation. By July 2024, they formalized their break by signing the Alliance of Sahel States Confederation Treaty, a direct challenge to ECOWAS authority. How did it come to this? To understand, we have to rewind nearly half a century, back to Lagos, 1975. A moment of ambition, when 15 young nations dared to believe they could remake their future together. The birth of a dream. The 1960s brought independence to West Africa, but it did not erase the borders left behind by colonial powers. Drawn in distant European conference rooms, they cut across ancient trade routes and ignored local realities. Ancient trade routes that once tied the region together were suddenly split apart. A Yoruba trader from Lagos could no longer cross into Accra. Fulani herders now faced barriers on lands their ancestors had roamed freely for generations. The impact was immediate and severe. Regional trade collapsed. Under the great empires of Mali and Songhai, commerce had flowed across the Sahara. By the 1960s, after independence, less than 10% of trade occurred within West Africa. Most countries conducted far more business with Europe than with their regional neighbors. A question soon rose among regional leaders. Could West Africa rebuild its connections, this time on its own terms? On May 28, 1975, the answer took shape. In Lagos, Nigeria's General Yakubu Gowon welcomed presidents and prime ministers from across the region. Together, on that same day, they signed the Treaty of Lagos, and ECOWAS was born. The vision was bold: a customs union, a common market, and eventually, a shared currency. The promise was simple but powerful. If West Africa united as one, its estimated 446 million people and vast resources, from Nigeria's oil to Ghana's gold, from Senegal's phosphates to Guinea's bauxite, could transform the region into a formidable economic force. Promise versus reality. ECOWAS was built on three promises. First, free movement of people, a region where citizens could live, work, and travel across borders without barriers. The ECOWAS passport, introduced in the 1980s, became a symbol of that dream, a borderless West Africa. Second, expanded trade. The ECOWAS Trade Liberalization Initiative, launched in 1979, pledged duty-free access for locally produced goods. Agricultural products, handicrafts, and later industrial goods were meant to move freely across the region. And third, collective security. The 1981 Protocol on Mutual Assistance in Defense laid the foundation for regional peacekeeping, built on the idea that instability in one country would be met by the strength of all. But between promise and reality lay the hard road of implementation. Travelers still faced endless checkpoints, piles of paperwork, and suspicion. A 2020 study found it took, on average, 11 hours to cross a single ECOWAS border, longer than flying from Lagos to London. After 4 decades, the Trade Liberalization Initiative accounted for only a very small share of intra-regional trade. Some studies estimate it represented less than 5%. To qualify, products had to be mostly made in West Africa, at least 60% of the materials, or significantly processed within the region. But many countries didn't have the factories or industries to meet that bar. Even Nigeria, the region's largest economy, had only a handful of products that met the criteria under the initiative. The push for a single currency stalled for decades. Deadlines had been postponed repeatedly since the early 2000s. The latest target is 2027. Yet in 2019, only Togo met the required economic benchmarks. And on security, the region soon faced defining tests, one that would shape ECOWAS's identity and reveal both its potential and its limits. The long shadow of history. Long before ECOWAS, the Sahel and forest zones were interconnected by trade and culture. The Mali Empire exemplified this at its height in the 14th century, spanning from the Atlantic coast to the Niger River. Its ruler, Mansa Musa, demonstrated the region's extraordinary wealth during his 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca. His caravan carried so much gold that markets fluctuated in every city he visited, creating economic ripples that historians still discuss today. Throughout this era, caravans crossed the deserts, Timbuktu scholars produced manuscripts that carried new ideas, and markets thrived in cities like Gao. These empires held vast lands together. Through fragile bargains, local leaders allowed trade routes to pass, caravans moved under negotiated protection, and alliances shifted with need. Unity was never imposed from above. It was practical, built on trade, kinship, and mutual benefit. It's a legacy that still echoes today. It reminds us that regional cooperation in West Africa is not foreign. It has always been there. The real question was never whether to connect, but how. The era of sanctions and power. By the 1990s, ECOWAS began to evolve. What started as an economic forum gradually took on a more assertive role in the region's political and security landscape. As civil wars broke out and democratic institutions faltered, ECOWAS intervened with unprecedented force. Its peacekeeping arm, the Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group, or ECOMOG, was deployed in response to some of the region's most fierce conflicts. In Liberia, civil war had erupted by late 1989. In August 1990, ECOMOG forces landed in Monrovia, led by Nigeria and supported by troops from Ghana, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. The mission initially succeeded in halting widespread atrocities and re-establishing a degree of order. But from the outset, the intervention was fraught with controversy. Nigeria's outsized role, providing both the majority of troops and funding, led to allegations of political dominance. ECOMOG forces were also accused of aligning with local actors, including the Armed Forces of Liberia, a group responsible for serious human rights violations. Allegations of looting by peacekeepers further tarnished the mission's reputation, prompting Liberians to coin a bitter nickname for the force: every car or movable object gone. Despite multiple peace agreements, including the Yamoussoukro Accords, the conflict persisted. Fighting continued until the election of Charles Taylor in 1997, and even then, disarmament remained incomplete. ECOWAS ultimately viewed the intervention as a failure to deliver lasting peace. In Sierra Leone, a similar pattern emerged. Following a 1997 coup that removed President Ahmad Tijan Kaba, ECOMOG intervened once again. By early 1998, the elected government had been reinstated, but violence persisted until 2002, when peacekeeping responsibilities were transferred to the United Nations. These early interventions revealed a consistent pattern. ECOWAS was unwilling to remain on the sidelines during regional crises. But in both Liberia and Sierra Leone, it was Nigeria that led the charge, supplying the majority of troops, funding logistics, and often setting the pace for decision-making. In effect, ECOWAS's ability to intervene depended heavily on Nigeria's willingness to act. This dynamic gave Nigeria significant influence over the direction and scope of the Bloc's responses, shaping not only operations on the ground, but also the broader perception of ECOWAS as a Nigeria-led effort. For some, this marked a turning point, proof that ECOWAS could take bold action to defend constitutional order and regional stability. For others, it raised concerns about overreach, a powerful member state using the Bloc to impose decisions on countries already in turmoil. In the years that followed, ECOWAS expanded its political role even further. The 2001 Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance formalized its commitment to democratic norms. Coups were condemned, sanctions were imposed, elections were monitored. ECOWAS was no longer just a regional trade bloc, it was evolving into a political actor, one that claimed the authority to shape governance across West Africa. The modern crisis, from coups to the AES breakaway. The 2020s brought a defining test. Across the Sahel, governments faced escalating jihadist insurgencies that had already taken thousands of lives and displaced millions more. In vast rural areas, state services collapsed, security was thin, trust in leadership unraveled. Amid this crisis, one by one, elected governments fell. On August 18, 2020, Colonel Assimi Goïta led a military coup in Mali, ousting President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. ECOWAS responded swiftly by suspending Mali from regional bodies, closing borders, and imposing financial restrictions. Under pressure, the military agreed to a transitional government led by civilians, but real power remained with Goïta. Then, in May 2021, after disputes over the direction of the transition, Goïta led a second coup, this time arresting the interim civilian president and prime minister and assuming leadership directly. ECOWAS responded by doubling down with even tougher trade and financial sanctions. Then came Burkina Faso. In January 2022, Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba seized power, deposing President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore amid rising violence and deepening public frustration. Again, ECOWAS suspended the country and imposed targeted sanctions. Just 8 months later, in September 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traoré led a coup, ousting Damiba over continued insecurity. ECOWAS again condemned the takeover and maintained Burkina Faso's suspension from regional gatherings. In July 2023, Niger followed. General Abdourahmane Chiani overthrew President Mohamed Bazoum, one of the last democratically elected leaders in the Sahel. This time, ECOWAS's response was the most severe yet. Border closures, a no-fly zone, asset freezes, and even the threat of military intervention. But something had shifted. The three coup-led governments didn't retreat. They aligned, coordinating statements, signing mutual defense pacts, and framed ECOWAS as a punitive force disconnected from on-the-ground realities. For them, the sanctions weren't restoring democracy. They were worsening the crisis. The economic pain was immediate and widespread. In landlocked Niger, dependent on trade routes through Nigeria, fuel prices tripled, food shortages intensified. Mali's economy took a hit under the sanctions. Trade slowed, prices rose, and overall production and incomes declined, with one estimate showing a 1% drop in 2022. And while the sanctions were meant to pressure leaders, it was ordinary citizens already grappling with violence, inflation, and displacement who felt the brunt. Public anger surged. In the streets of Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, anti-ECOWAS protests became common. So did anti-French slogans. To many across the Sahel, sanctions felt less like tools of diplomacy and more like collective punishment, applied without addressing the roots of insecurity. And in 2024, the fracture was sealed, not with dialogue, but with departure. On January 28th, the military governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger announced their immediate withdrawal from ECOWAS, with the exit set to take legal effect on January 29, 2025. Their joint statement was direct and defiant. They accused the Bloc of imposing inhumane sanctions and of acting under the influence of foreign powers, especially France. The shockwaves were immediate. 3 nations, together controlling over 1.2 million square kilometers and home to 76 million people, had walked away from a long-standing institution of regional integration. But their exit pointed to more than a political break. It exposed deeper questions about how regional unity is reimagined or how it should evolve. The watchdog with blind spots. The departure of the Alliance of Sahel States marked a historic rupture, one that served as a mirror, revealing how ECOWAS applied the values it claimed to uphold. With the world watching, would it consistently uphold the principles of democracy or expose the selective nature of its moral authority? The first test came in Togo. In the spring of 2024, the government enacted a sweeping constitutional change, shifting the country from a presidential to a parliamentary system. The move, widely criticized as a constitutional coup, enabled President Gnassingbé to extend his grip on power after 19 years in office. Despite triggering nationwide protests and widespread condemnation from civil society, ECOWAS issued no official statements or sanctions. A similar scene unfolded in Côte d'Ivoire. Ahead of the October 2025 elections, President Alassane Ouattara announced his intention to seek a fourth term. Thousands of Ivorians protested, not only against the extended mandate, but also against the exclusion of prominent opposition figures such as Laurent Gbagbo and Tidjane Thiam from a race. Once again, no official statements from ECOWAS. For many across West Africa, the Bloc's silence was jarring. It appeared to validate one of the Sahelian alliance's core critiques, that ECOWAS had become less a union of democratic ideals and more a coalition of entrenched incumbents. The Bloc's double standard was no longer a matter of perception, but of public record. The implication was clear. A coup in a military uniform was a crime, but a coup in a suit and tie, delivered through constitutional manipulation or judicial means, was met with official silence and diplomatic euphemisms. In this context, ECOWAS, the region's self-described watchdog of democratic norms, revealed its blind spots for the world to see. The deep fractures in West Africa's Bloc. Beneath the headlines lie deeper fractures, not just political, but competing visions of what West African unity should look like. A growing trust gap had already taken root, and it didn't begin with the recent coups. To many across the region, ECOWAS felt distant, elite, disconnected from the daily realities of travel, trade, and security. In some cases, a student in Niamey faces fewer hurdles getting a visa to France than to a neighboring ECOWAS country like Ghana. For ordinary citizens, the dream of integration often felt slow, uneven, or simply out of reach. And the fractures weren't just about bureaucracy. They could be seen in the long-standing problems the Bloc seemed powerless to solve. Consider the small border town of Yenga in Sierra Leone, locked in a territorial dispute with Guinea for more than 2 decades. Yenga is more than a quiet border village. It's a place where history, conflict, and untapped wealth converge. Tucked along the Makona River, it was once a fishing community, largely unknown beyond its banks. But everything changed when diamonds were discovered in the riverbed. Almost overnight, this unassuming village became a strategic prize, rich in resources and national interest. During Sierra Leone's civil conflict, Guinean troops entered Yenga to help repel rebel forces. But even after the war ended, and despite multiple bilateral agreements affirming Sierra Leone's sovereignty, alongside mediation led by ECOWAS, Guinean forces have not fully withdrawn. The continued military presence reflects deeper tensions rooted in the region's diamond wealth, which remains a source of unresolved contention. For the people who live there, the promise of a borderless West Africa is a bitter irony. Today, Yenga endures as a lingering flashpoint, underscoring not only the complexities of post-conflict border management, but also the limitations of ECOWAS in settling disputes over territory and resources. The failure to resolve long-standing tensions reflects a deeper dilemma facing the Bloc itself: how to reconcile national sovereignty with the push for regional integration. At the heart of the divide lies a core tension: sovereignty versus integration. The Sahelian alliance presented a bold alternative, one built on independence, self-determination, and a deliberate break from outside influence. By May 2025, that shift was on full display. French troops had already been expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Then came a historic turning point. France closed its last military base in Dakar and withdrew its remaining soldiers from Senegal, bringing an end to a decades-long military presence in West Africa. The message from the Alliance of Sahel states was clear: African-led solutions, not foreign footprints. To critics, that stance may seem contradictory, especially as Mali partnered with Russia's Wagner Group to reclaim territory. But for Sahelian leaders, the issue isn't foreign help itself, it was who gets to choose the terms. And for many across the region, that distinction mattered. The message resonated with populations who had long endured insecurity and economic hardship, despite decades of foreign aid and international intervention. While both blocs promote regional cooperation, their approaches differ. ECOWAS has long promoted deeper integration by encouraging member states to share authority with regional bodies, like its Commission, Court, and Parliament, in pursuit of a unified political and economic vision. The Sahelian Bloc, by contrast, frames its cooperation as a partnership among sovereign equals, pooling resources selectively for defense and development, while preserving national autonomy and resisting outside influence. But no model of regionalism can succeed without trust. And today, that trust is in short supply. Many across the region view ECOWAS as dominated by powerful states like Nigeria. Others see it as too closely aligned with foreign interests. And across the region, a generational shift is underway. The region's youth are questioning the frameworks they've inherited. The old scripts of cooperation, written in the optimism of the 1970s, are being reinterpreted or rejected. Many are asking, why follow rules made by institutions that feel ineffective or even illegitimate? And layered beneath that skepticism are deeper structural divides, colonial legacies, linguistic barriers, and economic systems that continue to shape who holds influence and who is left out. 8 West African countries, all members of the West African Economic and Monetary Union Bloc, continue to use the CFA franc, a currency pegged to the euro and backed by French reserves. For many, it stands as a lingering symbol of economic dependence. The long-standing ambition to introduce a new ECOWAS-wide currency, the ECO, was meant to unify the region under a single monetary system. But while the vision spans all 15 member states, only the countries using the CFA franc were institutionally prepared to make the transition. Years of postponements have left many skeptical that the region will ever adopt a single currency. For critics, it's just one more example of ECOWAS making big promises and failing to deliver. Closing, crossroads, and new beginnings. From the ancient trade routes that linked Timbuktu to Cairo, to the post-independence vision that gave rise to ECOWAS, West Africans have always sought ways to build across borders. But unity only endures when people see themselves in it. The withdrawal of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso doesn't necessarily mark the end of West African integration. It signals the start of something different, a more flexible, more voluntary, and more locally grounded model of cooperation. ECOWAS still stands. With 12 member states and over 370 million people, it includes major economies like Nigeria and Ghana, stable partners like Senegal, and fast-growing markets like Côte d'Ivoire. The question isn't whether West Africa will cooperate. It's how. And once again, the region finds itself at a crossroads. Is this the end of ECOWAS as we know it? Or the beginning of a new West African order? The answer won't come from communiques alone, but from the choices the region makes, together or apart, in the years ahead. The dream of West African unity isn't dead. It's being reimagined by a generation that refuses integration without representation and cooperation without sovereignty.